Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm very excited to have you all here for our webinar today, Silencing Shame Before It Silences You. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Erin Byerly, and I'm your Alumni Services Coordinator, and I'll be your moderator for today's online presentation. Before I introduce you all to today's presenter, Ashley Moser, LMFT CEDS, Clinical Education Specialist at the Renfrew Center, I want to go over a few announcements just to give some others some extra time to join. So I'm excited to announce our upcoming alumni panel discussion, Spring into Strength, Maintaining Your Recovery Year-Round. This is taking place on Tuesday, April 29th from 7 till 8:30 p.m. And I will be joined by 3 alumni to discuss their recovery journey and how they work to maintain recovery throughout the year. We're also very excited to announce our virtual alumni reunion, Continuing Connections and Anniversary Reunion, will be taking place on Saturday, June 7th. This special anniversary edition of our virtual alumni reunion will provide attendees with a chance to reconnect with Renfrew staff, as well as gain valuable skills and insights that will continue to assist in their recovery. We are also continuing to host our residential alumni support group monthly, with the next meeting scheduled for next week on Tuesday, April 22nd from 4 until 5 p.m. and then in May on Tuesday, the 20th. So we are hoping to see our residential alumni there. We also have a new outpatient group options for those in the Northeast area. On this slide, you can see the groups being offered in Paramus, New Jersey, White Plains, New York, and Boston, Massachusetts. If you're interested in participating in any of these groups, you can reach out to our program information department at 1-800-RENFREW, and they'll be able to get you set up. Next month, I'll be presenting our monthly webinar, Standing Up and Speaking Out, Becoming Your Own Advocate, where we'll review ways to advocate for your needs in both big and small ways in your life. And then on Wednesday, June 11th, Dr. Sam DeCaro will be presenting a webinar titled Rising Under Pressure, Navigating Recovery in the Era of Ozempic, which is definitely a very timely topic. So these monthly webinars are a great way to get some extra support around more specific topics. And we've got a lot of great topics coming up. Registration for any of the events can be found on the events page at renfrewcenter.com. So definitely check that out and get registered for anything that interests you. And if you have more questions or feel like you need more support either at this time or in the future, please feel free to give us a call at 1-800-RENFREW, and our program information department will be happy to talk with you about what you need and how we can best support you in your recovery. So following the webinar, we would love your feedback. You will be getting an evaluation form via email. It is very easily completed online, and this gives us a lot of insight into what we're doing well, what are areas where we could be offering some more support, and it really helps us with developing new and innovative programs to continue to assist you in your recovery. So I really encourage you to take a couple minutes and just fill that out after you receive that email. We will also be doing question and answers following the presentation today. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the chat function. Just make sure you're sending the chat to the panelists and not to everyone, so your questions are just going to us. And we will hold the questions until the end of the session when Ashley has finished presenting, and then we will get to as many as we can. So I would now like to introduce you to today's presenter. Ashley Moser, LMFT CEDS, is a clinical education specialist at the Renfrew Center. Ashley received her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and her master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Northwestern University. Ashley has extensive experience in providing family therapy and clinical supervision, with a focus in the treatment of eating disorders and co-occurring mood disorders. Ashley is a frequent speaker on the topics of body image, evidence-based treatment of eating disorders, and engaging families in the treatment process. So I'm so excited to now turn it over to Ashley to go into today's presentation.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for joining. This is taking time out of your busy day, your busy life to focus on recovery, period. I think it's awesome. I think it's wonderful that you're willing to join us. So thank you. Thank you for being here. So when we think about today's hour, which is going to fly by quite quickly, I want to talk a little bit before we jump right in about this really heavy topic. When I was asked to come up with, topics for a presentation, it was suggested to talk about shame. And I have to be honest, my first reaction to the thought of doing a webinar on shame was, I don't know, that sounds like a lot. It sounds like a big topic to have to cover in a very short period of time. It also sounds really heavy emotionally. It sounds kind of intense. So I have to be honest, like my first reaction to thinking about doing a presentation on shame was, I don't know. So if any of you had that same thought when you read this title and description, I'm right there with you. But we can do hard things, right? We can lean into the discomfort, our beliefs around shame and what it is, what it means, what it feels like, and try to sort of navigate this together. So I guess I want to acknowledge, talking about shame is intense. It's tough. And this is a really big topic that today's webinar is only going to scratch the surface on. But it's a really important topic at the same time. So we're going to do our best to approach versus avoid this tricky and notoriously difficult emotion while also, really trying to, cover a broad range of aspects of shame. So we're going to talk about what it is, what and why it holds us back. Why is it connected to eating disorders? We're also going to talk a lot about how it functions, because believe it or not, shame actually serves a function. It just may actually be misfunctioning a little bit in the way that it may be experiencing and promoting eating disorder behaviors. But of course, I couldn't talk all about shame today and not then leave you with some ideas about what you can actually do about it when you're experiencing it. If you feel like shame is holding you back or silencing you, what can you do? We need to have some skill sets. We need to think that part through. So we're going to cover a lot. We're going to cover a notoriously difficult topic. But like I said, we can do hard things. I think the why behind this webinar is exactly that. We want to practice approaching notoriously difficult emotions because our attempts to avoid, suppress, contain, run away from emotions tend to actually lead us back to the eating disorder. The eating disorder is a great way for us to not feel. It's a great way for us to stay away from difficult, tricky emotions. And we're trying to do the exact opposite of that in recovery. So shame in particular is one that I think trips a lot of people up. And so that is the true why behind trying to talk about this today. We want to approach versus avoid shame. And this is just the beginning of doing that. And I will leave you with some ideas as to how you can take this more into your life. We've also actually presented on this topic a few times before. So if you've seen this in an on-demand capacity, it may seem somewhat familiar, but there's a reason for that. Approaching things once, as we've learned, is not necessarily enough for us to feel like we have the ability to approach it in a way that's going to help us move away from eating disorder behaviors. Approaching shame once, having success, and never approaching it again isn't necessarily going to promote sustainable long-term recovery. And that's what we're out here after. So we're going to do this again, but we're actually going to do this in a continuation of the conversation. It's going to be more in depth. It's going to allow more time for questions, which of course on demand doesn't facilitate or allow for. And so my hope is that if you've already experienced some of this conversation already, that you're going to lean in and further expose and further engage in the conversation around shame and how we can prevent it from silencing us. So without further ado, let's take a deep breath and approach shame. So shame, we need to figure out what it is in the first place, right? I think there's a lot of misconceptions actually about what it is. We know it when we feel it, but man, it's hard to remember what it is and why we experience it. So in its pure definition, shame is a feeling of embarrassment or humiliation that arises from having done something dishonorable, immoral, or improper. That's really interesting, right? So shame is a feeling that comes up when we've done something dishonorable, immoral, or improper. It's interesting how sometimes shame isn't always just experienced in those situations, right? We're not always doing something dishonorable, immoral, or improper, but shame still somehow shows up. Interesting. We'll talk more about that. So when shame is chronic and it's not just a one-off experience, it can involve a feeling that you are fundamentally flawed or shameful, wrong, bad. And I think a lot of people who experience eating disorders have that chronic experience that there is something fundamentally bad, wrong, or shameful of not just about the behaviors that they engage in, but sometimes about them as people. And this is where shame can sometimes drive eating disorder behaviors as a way to cope with the discomfort of acknowledging that feeling. That's a really heavy thought process and emotional experience. And interestingly enough, at the same time, the disorder behaviors themselves can evoke a feeling of shame because they can be perceived as being wrong or bad, making also the person themselves feel wrong or bad for engaging in them. I hear clients say that all the time. I don't want to be the type of person that has this relationship with food. I hear it with self harm as well. I hear I don't want to be the person that does this bad thing, but my emotions about being bad drive me to keep doing the thing that makes me feel bad. How do I get out of this cycle? And shame, it is exactly that. It can become a cycle of this inherent feeling of being bad, wrong, and then engaging in behaviors that reinforce that, just that. So shame and eating disorders, what are some of the specifics? Why are these linked? I'm sure many of you have either experienced this or have talked to others who have experienced this, but shame and eating disorders can often manifest in body image. I oftentimes hear clients talk about how their body size or shape is shameful and they feel shame as a result of that. And their body size or shape, it's feeling shameful, wrong, or bad because it doesn't fit with the societal or cultural ideal. And really, what we know that's out there right now, especially now, gosh, it feels like more now than ever, is the thin ideal is really being reinforced, capitalized on, and pushed in a very, very strong way. Bodies that do not fit this ideal can feel wrong or bad because we're seeing on television that there are things we should be doing about it. And that message that we should change our bodies, shrink them, make them smaller, make them more digestible is something that we're seeing and hearing in many, many facets of life. It's on the news, it's in media, it's on social media. Sometimes we're hearing it in our families and in our social circles. And if you feel like your body shape or size does not fit this thin ideal, well, no wonder there can be some shame. So it's not just that my body is different and that feels wrong or bad, but my body and myself feel very intertwined and connected. I also hear this a lot coming up for folks that have physical differences in their body. So maybe they have some disability, maybe they struggle with scars, maybe they experience a part of their body that doesn't work in the way that they want it to or function in the way that they want it to. And those physical differences, instead of acknowledging that they exist, there can sometimes be this embarrassment, humiliation, or shame that is experienced as a result of, again, being different, not fitting this ableist societal construct. I also see shame show up not just around the body, but also around eating disorder specific behaviors. So even though we oftentimes talk about eating disorder behaviors as emotion driven behaviors, and whether it's restricting, binging, purging, or the plethora of other behaviors, we kind of look at them as like a interchangeable conversation. But eating disorder behaviors are not necessarily created equal when it comes to their experience. I do think that there's like a morality and a goodness and a badness and a bit of a continuum for a lot of folks in terms of what eating disorder behavior they're actually using. So I see a lot of folks who experience restriction as being far less shameful than purging or engaging in binging. Believe it or not, I have a client in particular that comes to mind. We've been working together for multiple years, and talking about binging continues to evoke so much shame that it almost stops her in her tracks. She's not able to speak. She's not able to look me in the eye. And this is someone that we've grown a trusting, connected relationship with for many, many years. And that behavior, not the restriction, but the binging in particular, causes that shame to emerge and the disconnection to happen in our relationships. I guess I just want to acknowledge not all eating disorder behaviors feel the same when it comes to shame. And I also want to acknowledge that trauma and shame are often intertwined. The experience of something bad happening to us makes us believe at times that we and ourselves are bad too. And that trauma can sometimes even involve the body, which of course then connects it to body image, eating disorder, and that vulnerability is even more likely to occur. I had a conversation with a client today about shame and trauma as well. This belief that from a family perspective, if you're a good person that does good things happen to you. So how does it make sense then if something bad has happened to me, something I didn't want to have happened? If that happens, and maybe it happens repeatedly in my life, I must have done something or be bad myself. And so, man, we worked through that in a pretty strong way today, but it's fresh in my mind. So I want to acknowledge that shame and eating disorders become intertwined for a lot of reasons. But for these three specific ones are ones that I hear very, very regularly when it comes to body image, the behavior specific itself, And then, of course, the existence and experience of trauma. Not everyone who struggles with an eating disorder has experienced trauma, but many have. So, what's the good news? If we are talking about shame, and I've made a strong case as to why it's important that we talk about it and how intertwined it can be with the relationship with food and body, it's heavy. So we're going to, stop at this point. We've got an emoji, we've got something to lighten the mood. Take a deep breath, check in with ourselves, see where we are on the emotional tolerance scale here, and kind of shift gears slightly. So the good news is that even though these things are very much connected, that shame is actually just another emotion. And I say just, but like I kind of want to put like air quotes there. It's just another emotion that is part of the human experience. If you experience shame, it does not mean that you are doing something wrong as a person. Shame is not an indicator that you are wrong. Shame is not an indicator that you are doing something different than what you should be doing. Maybe that's how it functions to some degree, but when it gets internalized, that's where things go wrong. And I think a lot of people who experience shame assume that if I'm experiencing shame, I must be a shameful person. And I want to acknowledge that it's not about that. It's about the fact that experiencing shame is actually a normal part of the human experience, which is why we all can acknowledge it is a notoriously difficult emotion because we've all felt it. Not only bad people feel shame, everyone feels shame. It is a normative, functional, emotional experience when we treat it as such. When it gets chronic, when it gets internalized, that's where things go wrong. But we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So, just like shame and just like every other emotion, there is a function here. Our emotions are our check engine light, right? They let us know when something's going on. We need to pay attention to them, we need to listen to them. Oftentimes, we're so busy trying to push past them, ignore them, brush over them, that we don't get the information that we need. When emotions show up, we need to listen, we need to answer the phone. We don't need to ignore it. Because if you think about it from like a check engine light with your car, if that light's going off and you don't pay attention to it, is your car going to keep going? Eventually, it's not going to function anymore. And I hate to say it, but we're very similar to cars in that fashion. If we ignore our emotions for a long period of time, we are missing important information where we need to slow down, stop, get a tune up before we go back on the road. And we may end up actually crashed if we are not able to stop and slow down and listen. So if you take nothing else with you, I suppose the car analogy could be a good one when it comes to feelings. We need to pay attention to them, even shame. What ends up happening is that it's not that some emotions are good and some emotions are bad. Even though we may be experiencing some of them to be more tricky, more notorious, more challenging, it's not necessarily that shame in particular and a host of other emotions that get labeled bad are actually bad. They're just really difficult to deal with. And oftentimes we have very negative reactions to those emotions. It feels awful to feel like we've done something wrong, shameful, to feel humiliated or embarrassed. But our reaction to that emotion is actually what causes more of our problems than the emotion itself. So, what ends up happening is that we react to the uncomfortable, distressing emotion with an eating disorder behavior. We try to avoid it by staying super busy and distracted. Maybe we isolate so we never have to be around people and experience that same experience or experience the possibility that someone else could evoke that sensation for us. And what ends up happening over a period of time, the more we avoid, the more we use the behavior to manage uncomfortable emotions, the more we get stuck in these shame cycles where we do something, we experience shame, we do something that is out of character and misaligned with our values, and then we feel more shame. And we just go around and around. So it's important to remember that all feelings have function, including shame, and that it's not the emotion itself that is dangerous or problematic. It is our reaction to the emotion. And for those of you who could always benefit from a friendly reminder of what emotions are telling us and what feelings are telling us, here is a quick review. It's important to remember that all emotions have function, and I can say that, but it's sometimes a nice reminder to be refreshed with what exactly are these emotions telling me. Anger is a big one. I feel like people experience shame surrounding anger at times, that anger can be a really, again, notoriously difficult emotion to tolerate. But anger shows up because it lets us know when a boundary has been crossed for us, a line's been crossed. We've been mistreated. Something's important to you. You need to protect your boundaries. Anger shows up because it is a call to action to right or wrong. It's important to remember that people see anger as this problematic experience but it's not the anger itself. It's how we respond to it. If we listen to it and we have a conversation, we set a boundary, we confront a difficult situation, we're not going to necessarily have that same shameful experience with anger. But if we show up in a way that's way outside of our character, way misaligned with our values, right? We show up and we yell, we throw a fit, we get loud. That's going to be behavior that's misaligned. And that's where shame is more likely to show up. So, a great example to link in was shame, but there's a whole host of other emotions that it's important to remember that they have function. They're showing up for a reason, and we need to listen to them and respond accordingly. Fear, yeah, we need to escape. Maybe we need to fight. I don't know about that one, depending on the social context, right? But we may need to escape a situation. Fear shows up because we need to be alert, we need to be worried, we need to be concerned, we need to act. Sadness shows up to draw people in so that we have connection and soothing and comfort from others, as much as that might be uncomfortable, especially if it might not always be safe or available. But it does encourage us to slow down and acknowledge something's important to us. Joy can sometimes be a difficult emotion for people to sit with as well. Sometimes feeling happy and excited, content can actually be just as uncomfortable as these negative emotions if you're worried it's going to be taken away. There's also disgust. Disgust and shame, I don't know, I feel like those can kind of sometimes play off of each other as well. If there's a feeling of disgust and you back away, there could be some shamefulness in how you respond to the disgust. Anxiety, so important to remember that we're not just anxious and it's something we need to manage and we need to put that, make sure that we're, pushing that emotion down because there's no need to be anxious. If we're feeling anxiety, it's because we need to get ready on purpose, or our bodies and minds feel like we need to get ready on purpose because of our lived experience. So again, just some examples as to all feelings have function, and then especially shame, and we'll talk about that next. So shame gets its own slide. So shame, what is it good for? Believe it or not, there is a function with this emotion as well. I know, I know. A lot of people think that shame is just like some, I don't know, some like bonus emotional experience that only bad people get, or only people who have, done something inherently wrong or are inherently wrong experience. But in reality, again, it is a normal functional emotion that we all experience. So how is it set up within us? So since we want to be accepted, period, I guess, as a socialized environment, shame becomes an evolutionary tool that keeps us all in check. So that's kind of interesting, right? That shame is something that helps us stay in community and in connection. So without shame, we might not feel like we have the need to adhere to norms, follow laws, or behave in a way that allows us to exist as social beings. Interesting. But okay, so we can get with that, right? So shame lets us know when we are acting outside of societal norms, when we are acting outside of the laws, when we are not following rules of engagement as a society. But shame becomes problematic, right? When it becomes internalized and results in an overly harsh evaluation of oneself as a whole person. So, somewhere along the lines, shame has gone from being this thing that we experience to help us know when we're stepping out of line, when we need to make amends, repair, address the fact that we've done something that is maybe against a rule or a law. But I think a lot of folks experience it in a way that becomes more like this third bullet point, which is that it becomes internalized. So it's not just that I did something that was outside of this societal expectation, but because I've done that, I am now a bad person, or I'm overly harsh and critical towards myself as a person for having done that. So we can see where shame may have started off with this, functionality that is supposed to be helpful for a society, but we can also see that it becomes very problematic when someone then internalizes shame as a part of who they are, not just something that they've done. I see this showing up a lot in core beliefs. I don't know if many of you have experienced the downward arrow. If you've obviously been a part of our programming, this may be another notorious exercise. And the reason why that is because it really gets you connected to what is underneath a lot of the fears that we have around our relationship with food and body image. Down, 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 way down. If you keep going, underneath a lot of our fear of weight gain, our fear of losing control, is that there are these core beliefs that we have about ourselves that drive this belief system, that drive these eating disorder behaviors, that drive us living outside of our values. And so these are some of the ones that I think commonly show up, and they feel like they're kind of connected to shame, right? Like, I'm worried I'm unlovable. I'm worried that I'll end up alone, not good enough, that I won't be deserving. I'm inherently bad. I'm too much. I hear a lot of these core beliefs and I see a lot of shame as a result of those. And whether the shame started and then the core belief developed or vice versa, these core beliefs can frame the lens in which you interpret yourself and behavior, and unfortunately can end up then reinforcing these beliefs. So if I'm more likely to interpret situations around me as reinforcing the fact that I'm not good enough, I'm going to be stuck in another one of these loops, another one of these cycles. And if I'm stuck in this cycle, my behaviors are going to follow. So if my core beliefs are that I am too much, and the lens that I see the world helps me have this biased confirmation that I only see situations through a lens that reinforces the fact that I'm too much, I'm going to feel pretty bad about that. And shame may develop as a result. Shame oftentimes evokes certain emotion driven behaviors that I think are important for us to pay attention to. Yes, we've talked about the link to eating disorder behaviors, but there's a lot of social behaviors that we see too that come from shame. When someone is experiencing shame, not just that they have done something that's immoral, but they themselves are immoral, we see them being more likely to hide, to shrink, to avoid, to conceal, to apologize. So I just picture this person who's like coming in on themselves, right? Like some of those pictures early on in the presentation, this like desire to hide, to disappear, to not be seen. Did that not sound like an eating disorder priming behavior or what? Like that, those types of behaviors, man, eating disorder just fits right in, right? But then we also have this other side of the coin, which I think is really interesting when it comes to shame. So I think we may have an easier time understanding and rationalizing why if someone feels like they have done something bad and are something bad, they're going to want to, shrink and come down and be more internalized. But then let's think about this other side of the coin where there's actually a lot of folks that when they experience shame do something more like this. There's a lashing out, attack, there's a projection. And so it's really interesting that even though shame can be a functional emotion and be experienced by everyone, people's emotion driven behaviors in response to shame can be drastically different. On one end of the spectrum, you have people isolating and concealing and shrinking. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are really called to action and are lashing out, attacking, projecting. And that can be really confusing, right? Especially if you are someone who that type of behavior feels very outside of context. And if we can think about it, those types of behaviors, the people who fall on that end of the spectrum, may be more likely to reinforce their relationship with shame because lashing out, attacking, projecting may actually trigger shame to function in that social evolution based way, right? That's not okay. Attacking people is not okay. Lashing out is hurtful to others. And there's some societal, like, that's not okay experiences that can happen. So here we go. The shame is activated. The behavior becomes shameful, which then reinforces the shame. And here we go around and around again. And yes, this is my point exactly. So we end up in this kind of short-term relief cycle. And this will feel very reminiscent of treatment experiences as well. But when we think about how to apply what we've learned in treatment specifically to this experience of shame, this is how I see that playing out. We're stuck in these short-term relief cycles, just like we are with eating disorder behaviors. So when shame is activated, we know that it's coming from a place of, trying to serve a functional evolutionary process, but it may have been internalized somewhere along the way. So it may actually be coming from a place that isn't about social, cultural, biological, evolutionary stuff. And it may be coming from our own lived experiences. So when that emotion starts to rise, we may start to want to make it go away. It's not comfortable. It is not fun to feel like not only have you done something wrong, but you are something wrong. And so you then are, of course, we have people who are engaging in eating disorder behaviors. We have people engaging in self-harm, but we also have people engaging in some of these other behaviors of shrinking, hiding, concealing, lashing out, attacking. And in response to those behaviors, whether it's the eating disorder, the lashing out, the self-harm, fill in the blank, sometimes we then feel shameful for the fact that we engaged in a behavior that was inconsistent with who we are, who we want to be, what we learned in treatment, what we've been working so hard to fight against. The shame that we can experience for, again, doing something that is out of context, not in line with not just like the societal beliefs, but what we believe and who we want to be. The shame that gets evoked there just ends up being reinforced once again. And we get stuck in these cycles of continuing to feel shame, doing these behaviors, having more shame and behaviors. And before you know it, the cycle becomes so quick, so automatic that it feels like it's really, really hard to interrupt. So how do we do just that? So if we're going to shift gears into what do we actually do about shame? I hope I've laid out some education as to what it is, why we experience it, why it's linked to eating disorders, and how we get stuck in these cycles. I want to then shift us to now think about what are we actually going to do about it? How can we work our way out of this? And again, this is going to feel like we're bringing in learned awareness tools and strategies that have been a part of treatment, but we're applying it specifically to shame. So this may feel like, I remember this skill, or I know this one, but let's look at it through this specific lens. So we know that we can't make changes in our emotional patterns if we don't slow down and understand and recognize what they are. So the first step in any sort of behavioral change or shifting that we want to do, or getting away from responding in the same way we always have, is to become aware of our patterns. And that first step for me is always encouraging people to check in with their emotional experience. How do you know it's shame? You don't know it's shame unless you are continuously in this pattern and are just noticing the behaviors. I think I get people stuck there a lot, right? They don't know that they're responding to shame. They just know that the behaviors that they experience are shaming or shameful. And so, because of that, the connection to the emotion is just because of a behavior, but it isn't necessarily like the full picture understanding of it. So, I always encourage people, but first step in any sort of change that we're trying to make, we need to understand what we're feeling. What does shame feel like in your body? Oof. This is where we probably have to take another deep breath and sort of lean in, right? What does shame feel like in the body? For some, that may feel incredibly intense. We have a lot of folks that experience physical sensations in a very intense way. And that may be a part of why the vulnerability to an eating disorder in the first place, not just shame, but just emotions in general. So, checking in with physical sensations. What does shame feel like in the body? How do you know you're experiencing it? For me, I think that desire to shield and hide and conceal would definitely show up. For me, physical sensations would probably experience like a flushing of the face, blushing. Typically, that's associated with embarrassment, but I think shame can also bring that up, that embarrassment, that feeling of being really hot, maybe the desire to hide. In doing virtual therapy, I see a lot of people that, make their way off screen, you know, their cameras start to shift up and off to the side. And that can sometimes be an indicator. Maybe that's more behavioral, but I think from a physical sensation, that may be that manifests and drives that desire to get off camera, to not be seen. But the physical sensations, I mean, I think being hot is definitely one of them. And whether you're lashing out or concealing, I think that would probably be one that we could recognize. Shame also, I think I hear people talk a lot about the physical sensation in the gut. Like your stomach just feels like it has a pit, just a really uncomfortable pit that, and no wonder it would make relationship with food really challenging if you have that physical sensation, right? Like that fits. When I want to think about thoughts that are showing up around shame, there can be a lot of thoughts around, negative self-talk. I mean, there's a host of negative self-talk that exists out there. And I think there are even some clients who really identify with thoughts around like not just like that critical self-talk, but sometimes it can even border on self-hate. If it's not just that I feel like I've done something wrong, but I am something wrong, sometimes the thoughts can even echo that. So paying attention to really intense negative self-talk, I think that's something we may be able to pick out in the thought experience that's connected to shame. And then behaviors and urges, I think we've talked a lot about the behavior piece, the lashing out, the hiding, the concealing. And like I said, in sessions, all of a sudden I notice people's, faces, I only get eyeballs, or, the people who have their head down, hats on, hoods up, the actual hiding. And then sometimes, I'm going to be honest, I've even had people that have like wanted to leave, have gotten up and left. Like, this is too much. I can't do this. I'm having to step away. Like the shame, it's one thing to feel shameful. It's another thing to feel it in connection and have someone else experience it. Like, I have to leave. So that can happen too. So we want to pay attention to, before we can break these cycles and do something different, how do you experience shame? How do you know that's what it is? And a 3-point check is a great emotion awareness tool to at least think into, what does shame feel like for me? How do I know I'm experiencing it? And whether it's just checking in with one of these pieces, that's a great place to start. But all three gives you a ton of information. So when I think about, what we're going to do, of course, to work our way through shame so that it doesn't silence us and we don't engage in behaviors that create and maintain that feeling of shame, we want to work towards building emotional resilience. That really is the name of the game, whether we're talking about eating disorder recovery or working through depression, anxiety, trauma. I mean, emotional resiliency is going to be it. It's where it's at. And if we have that in place, we can manage the shame in a way that isn't going to put us at jeopardy of engaging in behaviors that are going to reinforce that feeling. So, really, what we're going to cover right now is this idea of emotion awareness, which we did hit on with the three component model, that 3-point check. We're going to talk about emotion regulation. We're going to talk about self compassion and a little bit on connection, too. So, this is what I want us to be thinking about. If we're experiencing shame, we want to instead jump to those emotion driven behaviors. We want to jump to emotion awareness, checking in with ourselves, being compassionate towards ourselves, working on regulating our emotions, and or reaching out to people who are going to be connected and reciprocal and caring. So, if we want to move away from emotion driven behaviors, we have to know what we should be doing instead to some degree. Yes, we should be sitting with the emotion. We should be experiencing it. We should allow it to rise and fall on its own. All of that is good stuff. So, building that emotional tolerance is definitely an important piece of this. But again, I know that you may have been exposed to that in treatment. I want to continue to reiterate that. And I also want to add to the list of things that you can do in response to shame. You are to be working towards tolerance and allowing that to happen. But there's also some alternative actions that we can throw in here too that can help that process along. So we know the emotion driven behaviors with shame, that shutting down, isolating, withdrawing, lashing out, distracting, defending even. What could we be doing differently? Over here in the alternative action list, I've got, communicating with others, expressing ourselves, setting boundaries, potentially co-regulation, which means not just the emotion regulation for ourselves, but being with someone else who can help us co-regulate. We want to ask questions. We want to look at accountability. So these are all, if you've noticed, emotion-driven behaviors are very individual, very isolated, very, I think isolated and individualized, like they're within the person. But if you're looking over here at the alternative action, there's something to be said about those feeling like they're more about relationships and relationship to others. So I think shame, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, is going to drive more towards isolation. And as a alternative action in a big picture scheme, we want to counteract that. The more shame allows us to stay to ourselves and disconnect from others, the more vulnerable we are to engaging in very destructive and like not so great patterns. So we want to look at connection, leaning towards opening up towards people when we experience shame, even though that's the last darn thing most people want to do when they're feeling that way. So because shame serves a social function, we have to acknowledge that social has to be a part of this equation too. So we know that when people internalize shame, it becomes that, right, I did something wrong to I am wrong, something bad happened to me, or I'm inherently bad, or I must be bad if bad things happen to me. And what we end up seeing is exactly this, that isolation and disconnection become like a primary mode of coping, of regulating, of managing this uncomfortable experience. Because not only am I feeling a lot of distress, I want to stay away from others so that I can prevent that distress from being even more distressing. So we see a lot of folks really experiencing a lot of isolation surrounding shame. And we know that isolation is a huge vulnerability for mental health issues. COVID taught us nothing else. Like there is so much research and evidence out there now that supports the fact that we are social beings. We are made to be in connection to others, into community. And the more isolated we are, the worse our mental health becomes, including our relationship with food and body. So shame and isolation are often play off of each other and create even more of a vulnerability for mental health symptoms to worsen. So we talked about wanting that emotional resilience, emotional awareness. We want to know what shame is when we experience it. We want to know what some of the alternative actions are. But how are we working on ourselves? So let's say connection to others doesn't feel easily accessible, or let's say that connection to others is really complicated. Maybe the people in our lives aren't able, willing, present to be able to be the person that can listen, can validate, can co-regulate. That doesn't mean all hope is lost. Connection and community is really important, but we always have the connection and community within ourselves that we can be strengthening as along with this process. Self-compassion and shame seem like they go hand in hand. We've got shame, we've got self-compassion, and it feels like that self-compassion could be a very understandable next step if we're wanting to work through shame. The acknowledgement that you're not actually bad, that something you may have done is bad, but you yourself are not a bad person. Self-compassion, though, I think a lot of people who have internalized shame don't know that self-compassion feels accessible for them. And even myself as a clinician, sometimes I think when I think about self-compassion, I get a little bit of like an eye roll, like, okay, like this is what we're doing. This is the answer to these deep, dark, really notoriously difficult emotions. We're just going to be kind to ourselves. Well, I stand corrected in my own mind, and I'm really working through this too because I think self compassion is so much more than what we've acknowledged it could be. I think sometimes we write it off as this, like, lying to yourself or, telling yourself everything's going to be okay, even though you don't actually believe that it's going to be. And so, from a self compassion critic to what I'm assuming is maybe others on the other end of this webinar, I want to offer some ideas on self compassion that might feel actually accessible. So antecedents are really important. And I think I really anchor into those as a vehicle of creating self-compassion through context. So when I think about shame, and really when I think about any emotion-driven behavior or the development and experience of an eating disorder, I'm always looking for why is this happening? And antecedents are a really important piece of that. There is a lot of historical and lived experience that supports why people develop eating disorders and continue to use them, even if they're experiencing any level of consequence. Maybe they're not experiencing any, and that's a whole nother thing. But I think there are a ton of reasons that totally make sense as to why people reach for coping mechanisms that work in the short term, but cause a lot of destruction along the way in the long term. And so for me, looking at antecedents, which is really what comes before. What is your lived experience? What have you been through? What have you gone through? Why does this behavior make sense? That is where I find compassion in myself and the people around me and in clients as well, especially those who have a hard time at accessing self-compassion. I probably wouldn't even call it self-compassion. I would just say, like, how can we help your behavior, your emotion, your response to that emotion make sense? And the way that I would do that is by looking at what in your life has set the stage for this to happen. My guess is that the reason why you're responding to shame the way that you are makes a lot of sense. There's probably, and even if it wasn't some, grand, obvious reason, and maybe it was small, maybe it was built upon, maybe it was just little small instances over time. Maybe you can't find a reason at all, but my guess is that there is a strong reason out there somewhere that makes a ton of sense as to why you as a human are responding to this way. And that is enough for me, at least, for a first step towards self compassion. Acknowledging that my experience, whether it makes sense or not to other people, makes sense to me because of what I've been through and what I've lived through and what I'm continuing to live through. So, finding context is a great first step towards self compassion. Validation is another big piece when it comes to self compassion. And again, if we're missing community, if we have unavailable or inaccessible community, I do think there's still work we can do to help our own personal experience of validating ourselves, even our shame. So, Dr. Becky is a researcher and has a lot of really great information out there. And mostly she's in the parenting sphere, but she has a lot of really good information that talks about separating out the behavior from the person. That's the thing that I like the most about it. And I think that type of validation can be really helpful for us as people. So, yes, we are people that make mistakes. Maybe we do bad things. Maybe we've hurt people. Maybe we've done things that we're not proud of. I think we can all raise our hands that we fit in that category somewhere, right? How do we separate that out from making us a bad person? I think it's really important that we separate that out when it happens. And what Dr. Becky Kennedy talks about is like putting your hand on your heart. And if you're not a heart feely person, that's okay too. Maybe we just think about this and incorporate it at some point down the road. But there is something to be said about doing some individualized validation through putting our hands on our heart and acknowledging that this feels hard because it is hard. Maybe you don't even have to go back into all the antecedents. Maybe you don't have to tell yourself it makes sense because of X, Y, and Z. Maybe you just sit here and say that this feels hard because it is hard. Experiencing shame is hard. It is normal, functional, but it's hard. And I'm a good person having a hard time. Oof, that might be a stretch. Going from feeling like you're a bad person to a good person may feel like you're lying to yourself. And I don't want you to feel like you're lying to yourself. But if you're going to start establishing a new self-talk, a new neural pathway in your brain, it has to start somewhere. And there's something about saying that I can be a good person having a hard time. I can be a good person who's done something, who makes mistakes. I am a good person who's doing my best. there could be something along the line of acknowledging that I am a good person, even if you don't believe it right away. There may be something about saying that while you're, having that connection to your heart, to, I don't know, this feels like where your sense of self lives. I could be off. But doing that, I think, could be a step to rewiring a bit. That self validation. I know we look for validation typically externally, right? We want someone to tell us that it makes sense, that it's hard, it feels hard because it is hard, that you're a good person and going through a hard time and it's going to be okay. But maybe sometimes that isn't accessible. And so, how do we give that to ourselves? This feels hard because it is hard. And I'm a good person having a hard time. That might be hard to say. That might be hard to believe. But with practice, we might be able to get there. And for those who are fortunate enough to have community, lean into it. Finding and creating safe relationships, I think, is so, so important. Again, we've talked about how shame really disconnects people and isolates people, and it breeds and grows in isolation. So we want to find safe communities, safe connections, safe relationships where we can share our shame, share our emotions, show parts of ourselves that we have a hard time loving and experiencing. But sometimes, believe it or not, other people can see the parts of us that we have the hardest time loving and love them easier than we do ourselves. And sometimes it's like, wow, if that person thinks I'm all right, if that person has seen the nitty gritty, ugly side that I have a hard time showing other people, let alone experiencing myself, if they think I'm all right, maybe I'm all right. If they can see that part and stay connected to me and want to know me and want to be around me, maybe I can learn that too. So it doesn't have to come from establishing it within yourself first. Sometimes relationships can reflect that back to you in a way that we're not able to reflect to ourselves. I had a client today say that when she was in VIOP earlier this week, that the biggest lie that the eating disorder told her was that her family would judge her for having an eating disorder, and that it was the biggest lie that she's ever experienced. Because when she actually leaned into the family system that she has, every single one of them, and it's a big family, was supportive and loving and wants to know more about what's going on in program and how they can help. So the biggest lie that she was told through her eating disorder and through the shame that she experienced for having an eating disorder, especially as someone in midlife, especially as someone who's had a host of other stuff going on, the biggest lie that she's experienced is that she would be judged and shamed for having an eating disorder by the people who love and care about her. And that isolation was a huge barrier for recovery. Now, there's been a step towards stepping into the relationships that already exist. And even though there was some question, is this a safe space? Is this someone who's going to see and love me? It happened. And so I share that because the eating disorder may be lying to you too about your community. You may have people that are able to see and love you from top to bottom, in and out. And the eating disorder may be creating some of that disconnection. The shame may be creating some of that disconnection. So I also want to acknowledge that sometimes we don't have a community like that. Maybe we don't have family that can tolerate it. Maybe we don't have people in our lives that are there for us in that way. And that can be a really profound, lonely and sad experience too, especially when I'm sitting here saying that it's a key to recovery and recovering from a really difficult pattern. But you're not done meeting everyone you've ever are going to meet. There's a lot of new relationships out there that we just don't even know we're going to experience yet. So I want to acknowledge that the people we have aren't the only people we're ever going to have. But I also want to acknowledge that sometimes finding other people can be really hard. Making friends, especially if you're in adulthood, it's tricky. It's really tricky. And so trying to figure out where you can find relationships that are emotionally validating, reciprocal, where you can feel seen and heard can be really challenging. But I think support groups are a really great way to start that. And Erin listed off a ton at the beginning. So even if those don't exist in your relationship or in your life right now, there are relationships that you can engage with that have the parameters of being safe and supportive just by being a support group. And there are so many that we offer at Renfrew. Let us be your community. Let us help you find community amongst other people who are experiencing what you're experiencing and need support in the same way that you do. Let us help you with that, whether it's program, whether it's a support group, whether it's attending webinars like this. Let us be part of that community. And then once you're in the community, you have to share how you feel. Just being with other people feels good. It feels validating. It feels helpful. But being with other people and having this like internalized shame just spiraling in your brain and never having a place to come out sometimes is even more lonely than not being around other people when you're experiencing it. So I think it's really important that we think about how we can share our struggle. And if you literally want to keep these in like your back pocket, I think it can be really helpful. Sometimes we just need help getting started. That's always my hard part. I have a really hard time getting started, but once I get rolling, I'm all right. It's getting started. So I wanted to offer some prompts, some ways to start some of this process of sharing your internal experience with other people. It's scary, it's vulnerable, but it's so worth it. So here are some ways to do that. So this is what's happening for me. I've been thinking a lot about this. This is hard for me to say. I'm trying to do things differently. I think there's something to be said also about letting therapy or letting, webinars or experiences that you have through therapeutic interactions jumpstart conversations too. So, I had therapy yesterday and we had talked about X, Y, and Z. I tell my clients all the time, like, definitely use me as your starting off point if you need to. That in therapy, we were talking about, or my therapist said this, or my therapist told me to do this. That can sometimes be a way to start that process too. So, if you want to start there, no shame, absolutely zero shame in doing that. But if you're looking to kind of evolve past using a like situational cue to prompt a conversation, these can be some of the ways. I know that's something that I personally use when I have to share or talk about hard things. The one that I like to say a lot is I've been thinking a lot about this, or this has been on my mind. That's a good way to start a lot of the time. And then just general tips for all conversation. I mean, of course, if we are going to be doing something hard by talking about and expressing the things that are bringing up shame or acknowledging when it's happening, we're going to need some communication skills to do that. It's tough enough to acknowledge it within ourselves and do some of that self-validation, but to bring it in relationship with others is a task. So you may want to identify what you're feeling beforehand, and you may want so that you're prepared for the conversation. You're prepared to know what you need and what you want. You know the words that you want to use, the feeling words. You want to make sure that you're using I statements. You don't want to necessarily talk to people in a language that says you always, those kind of attacking statements or saying that other people are causing your shame. I think maybe there are circumstances where that can be true. I won't take that off the table, but I think starting conversations where you're exploring and bringing up that emotion, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's yours. It's what you're feeling. There's harsh versus soft startups. There's some research out there that shows that most conversations, like if they if they can't turn it around by like 3 minutes, like the conversation is just not going to recover. So there's something about how you start a conversation that matters more than honestly anything else. Like the tone really, really matters. So if you start a conversation with you always, you never, those types of statements, that tends to be more of that harsh startup. A soft startup is some of the things that we talked about on the last slide, which is, this is what's happening for me. I've been thinking a lot about this. Shame is really showing up for me in a big way. I'm feeling like I want to pull away, but I don't want to. I'm trying really hard to do the opposite right now. And then I think it's also important, especially for existing relationships, to acknowledge that, shame and the eating disorder and, a host of other things may be lying to you a bit and making you think that other people won't be there for you or can show up for you. So it's important to maybe retest some of those relationships. I acknowledge that history can repeat itself. And if you've had a negative experience with someone being less than validating or not showing up the way that you need them to, the thought of going back to that and doing it again may not be helpful. But there may be some relationships where, people deserve a second chance. And especially if they're a continued stay relationship for you, it might be worth it. And then I just want to acknowledge that we just have to do this all the time and practice it, because a one and done experience with trying to move through shame with yourself in the presence of others and community is not something that we do once, master it and move on. This is like riding a bike, but like, I don't know, a huge mountain bike of some kind that doesn't come with a lot of instructions and feels really intense and intimidating. So repetition, repetition, repetition. We need to practice this over and over again. And even if you're just practicing one component of it over again, I will promise you that there will be some movement in your life for the good. So in summary, shame is an emotion with function. It exists for a reason, but becomes really problematic when it's internalized. Shame and eating disorders are obviously very much linked and require Blah. Recovery requires addressing both. Some of the ways that we can do that is through self compassion, through emotion awareness and regulation, working on acknowledging that shame is showing up and not engaging in those emotion driven behaviors. And then, of course, utilizing connection and community when possible. So, this leads us to the end of our conversation today. I hope that there was something that was beneficial, helpful, supportive to you in your recovery journey. And I will pause now if there's any questions that we can answer that would be helpful as a part of this dialogue.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I mean, that it was just such a good discussion, and the idea of community is so important, and it's one of the reasons why I love that Renfrew has the alumni services department so that we can create community for people because like you said, it is so hard.
Yes.
I feel like you touched on this a little bit, but one of the questions we got was, can shame ever be a result not of something we did, but the environment that we find ourselves in?
100%. Yes. I think that is absolutely the case. When I think about shame in a lot of different like systemic ways, I think that shame can be a part of even like our identity to some degree based on societal expectations, constructs, discrimination, harassment. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which people are told that they are inherently bad, wrong, less than in our society that have nothing to do with them actually personally doing anything wrong. They're just existing. I think about
Mhm,
that. I think we see that a lot in those who are in larger bodies and are
mhm,
being told that there's something inherently wrong in existing in a larger body. I think we see that a lot in eating disorder treatment and recovery, but I think that exists when we're talking about race, when we're talking about sexual orientation, when we're talking about intersectionality, when it comes to different identities. Yes. And that was a piece that I want to touch on, and I think is an important part of the conversation too, that you haven't always done anything to feel shame. Sometimes, unfortunately, we live in a society that um, reinforces shame for existence, which is screwed up.
mhm. What would you suggest, like, in when we're finding ourselves in those environments or in those experiences, how do we kind of work through that when we are getting that messaging that for something out of our control, we're experiencing shame for?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and tricky at the same time. I think, the experience of shame makes sense based on the context, but it isn't necessarily inherent to our emotional experience. We're being told to feel shameful, but I don't know that that means you have to internalize, accept, or acknowledge that that's the emotion that you actually feel. So I think shame could be, you could be being shamed or being, shame being something that's expected for you to feel in those moments. I think shame in that context for me, there's a part of me that would really want to push back against that. And I would want anger to sort of show up potentially as the emotional experience that may be more um, adept at handling that dynamic. Of course, not every environment is safe to be able to do that, but I do think that just because you are in a context that is shaming does not mean that you need to feel shame. And maybe there's another emotion that's a better fit.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a
Sadness,
great
that it's
idea.
like that. Sadness, that it's like that. I mean, that's another one.
Yeah. Yeah, but, like, recognizing, like, okay, just because people are kind of hoisting shame upon me doesn't mean that that's what I actually feel. And I think again, then that's where that like community piece comes in of like finding other people that are in maybe similar situations or similar experiences and having that community of like, we don't need to take on what somebody else is putting on us.
And there's so much research out there that goes to show that when you're in community of people who also are experiencing that same shaming from a systemic perspective, that community amongst other people that share those experiences is like the number one protective factor. So if community wasn't something on the list of things to do, I hope it is now.
Yes, for sure. Well, actually, we're just about out of time. I know we've got about less than 1 minute, so we can kind of wrap up there. If anyone has additional questions or questions that kind of come up later, please feel free to reach out to Ashley at her email, or you can send them to alumni@renfrewcenter.com, and we'll be able to pass them along to Ashley. to her and get those answered for you. But I just want to again thank you so much, Ashley, for giving the presentation. It is such a heavy topic, kind of like you talked about, and so important that we lean in and we really talk about it so that it doesn't take over.
Okay, great.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for
everyone, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Bye.